There's 5 different ways that antibiotics can work. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at antibiotics that inhibit cell wall synthesis. So what I would do when you're studying is I would make a list of all of the antibiotics that inhibit cell wall synthesis and make sure you have those memorized. Because what I could do on the exam is I could have a question where I have a bunch of choices of antibiotics and ask which of the following antibiotics inhibits cell wall synthesis, and maybe one of the answer choices is penicillin, and that would be the correct answer. So those are the kind of questions I could ask on this. So we've got a couple of different antibiotics that will inhibit cell wall synthesis of the bacteria. We've got the beta-lactam antibiotics. They're called that because of their chemical structure. They all have a beta-lactam ring. So we've got the penicillins, cephalosporins, and carbapenems. We're not going to talk about the monobactams, so you don't have to memorize those. And then we've got bacitracin, vancomycin, and isoniazid. So what happens to the bacteria if you inhibit their cell wall synthesis and they're not able to make new cell wall as they're dividing is the water will just keep moving into the cell and they will swell and then they explode. So remember, we call that osmotic lysis. And that will kill the bacteria. And then the next question, do these antibiotics that inhibit the cell wall synthesis of the bacteria, do they affect our cells? And they don't, because our cells do not have a cell wall. Penicillin is the first beta-lactam antibiotic we're going to take a look at. It works by blocking the bacterial enzyme called transpeptidase. And transpeptidase works by linking together the side chains here on the peptidoglycan subunits, and that will join the peptidoglycan strands together. So if you can't join the peptidoglycan strands together, that will really weaken the cell wall, and that will allow the water to keep moving into the bacterial cell, and then it will just swell and then burst, and you get that osmotic lysis, and that will kill the bacterial cell. The penicillin will only work on growing bacterial cells that are dividing and producing new cell wall. If they're just sitting there and not dividing and producing new cell wall, then it won't kill them. So they have to be making new cell wall, which if you have an infection, they will be reproducing. So let's just take a look at some of the penicillin antibiotics. Highlighted in yellow here is the beta-lactam ring that is needed for the penicillin antibiotic to work and inhibit the transpeptidase enzyme and inhibit the cell wall synthesis of the bacterial cell. You don't need to know or memorize any of the different types of penicillin antibiotics. I won't ask you that at all. Okay, so some of the bacteria are resistant to the penicillin antibiotics, and how they do that is they produce an enzyme called beta-lactamase, which, if you remember, we talked about that when we talked about the CRE bacteria. Another name for beta-lactamase is penicillinase, so sometimes you'll see it called that as well. And what this beta-lactamase enzyme does that the bacteria produce is it chops the beta-lactam ring, and then the penicillin will no longer work. So it can no longer inhibit the cell wall synthesis. So that makes the penicillin just worthless. All right, so then we decided, well, let's one-up the bacteria, and we decided to add in clavulanic acid. So clavulanic acid is going to inhibit the beta-lactamase enzyme produced by the bacteria. So it's kind of like an arms race here. So let's just take a look at some pictures. All right, so I put down here that the bacteria make the beta-lactamase enzyme, and that's going to destroy the penicillin. So you can see the penicillin here, and here's the beta-lactamase enzyme produced by the bacteria, and you can see how it's chopped the beta-lactam ring and the penicillin, and now the penicillin doesn't work. Okay, so that'll make the bacteria resistant to the penicillin. So if we add the clavulanic acid in with our penicillin, what the clavulanic acid does is it inhibits the beta-lactamase enzyme from working. So if you add in the clavulanic acid, it'll block the beta-lactamase from working. Okay, so that's how it's going to work. Oops, it's an A. Okay, so one of the antibiotics that has clavulanic acid in it, the brand name is called Augmentin, so you may have heard of that. It's a pretty commonly prescribed antibiotic, and what it contains is a penicillin called amoxicillin and clavulanic acid. Okay, and you don't have to memorize Augmentin, I'm not going to ask you that, but just know what beta-lactamase is doing. It's being produced by the bacteria, it's destroying the penicillin, making the bacteria resistant to the penicillin, and then we've added the clavulanic acid in with the penicillin to block the beta-lactamase from working, and then that protects the penicillin, and so now the penicillin can work and kill the bacteria. Okay, so there's actually lots of different penicillins. They naturally come from mold, and we have tinkered with them in the lab. And I'm not going to ask you the different names of these, so you don't have to memorize those. Okay, we did come up with a beta-lactamase resistant penicillin in 1960 called methicillin. But then about a year after using methicillin in patients, we discovered MRSA. So there was a mutation in the Staph aureus bacteria, and that made it resistant to the methicillin. So that didn't take very long. So MRSA's been around for a while. So this little picture over here, this advertisement, penicillin cures gonorrhea in 4 hours. That was true, probably late 40s, but not true anymore. Unfortunately, gonorrhea is resistant to quite a few antibiotics now, so it's getting harder to treat. So another problem with penicillin, there are some people that are allergic to it, and they end up having what's called a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction, which we're going to talk about later. I'm not going to ask you about that right now, but just when you go back at the end of the course and are looking over notes, that'll make sense later. So, okay, cephalosporins are another beta-lactam antibiotic, very similar in structure to the penicillins, and they work the same way. So they're going to inhibit the bacterial cell wall synthesis, inhibit that enzyme transpeptidase, and you can see their structure here. They have that beta-lactam ring, just like the penicillin does. There's actually 5 generations of the cephalosporin antibiotics now. The first generation of an antibiotic is always the oldest, and it's going to be the most narrow spectrum. And then they keep developing newer generations because they want to make them more broad spectrum. And usually what they're trying to do is they're trying to get more gram negatives. So you can see this first generation gets the gram positives, and then as you get these higher generations, they're going to get more gram negatives. An example of a cephalosporin that you might have heard of is cephalexin, and that's commonly prescribed, and that's actually a first generation cephalosporin. Okay, another beta-lactam antibiotic that we talked about are the carbapenem antibiotics. So they also have that beta-lactam ring, and they inhibit bacterial cell wall synthesis in the same way that the penicillin and cephalosporins do. They were one of our big gun antibiotic of last resort. So if we had a bacterium resistant to everything else, we could pull out the carbapenems and it would kill it, but that's not the case anymore because we do have resistance to our carbapenems with our CRE bacteria. So remember, those were the Klebsiella pneumoniae and the E. coli bacteria. So they make those beta-lactamase enzymes, the KPC and NDM1 enzymes that will chew up the beta-lactam ring on the carbapenem antibiotics. Okay, our next one that inhibits cell wall synthesis is bacitracin. It works differently. It's not a beta-lactam antibiotic. How it works is it's going to inhibit a transport protein in the cell membrane of the bacterial cell that is used to transport these peptidoglycan subunits across the plasma membrane out to where they're making the cell wall. And so it just blocks that transport protein. So it just works a little bit different. I'm not going to ask you that. If you just know it inhibits cell wall synthesis, that's all you need to know. Okay. Bacitracin is only used topically as an ointment because it's too toxic with side effects to use internally. So they do have a bacitracin ointment, or if you have like Neosporin at home, Neosporin has 3 different antibiotics in it, and if you look on the label, you can see bacitracin is one of the 3 antibiotics in there. Okay, vancomycin, another one of our antibiotics that inhibits cell wall synthesis. And this was also one of our big gun antibiotics, drug of last resort. If we had a bacterium resistant to a lot of things like MRSA or Enterococcus, one of our escape pathogens, we could pull out vancomycin and kill it. But we've got resistance to vancomycin now. So we do have Versa, which is vancomycin resistant Staph aureus, and VRE, which is vancomycin resistant Enterococcus. Okay, so those are difficult to treat. So vancomycin doesn't get those anymore. How vancomycin got its name? It comes from a soil bacterium that they found in Borneo, and they named it vancomycin because it vanquished a lot of the resistant bacteria, and so that's how it got its name. Okay, and then our last one is isoniazid. It's going to inhibit the synthesis of mycolic acids. And remember that we find mycolic acids making that waxy layer outside the cell wall of the mycobacterium. And we're going to be using the isoniazid to treat tuberculosis. So Mycobacterium tuberculosis. We actually use 4 antibiotics together to treat TB because we have a lot of resistance. And so isoniazid is one of the antibiotics we will give you to treat TB. So